She's only here for the money. The words echoed across the mahogany dining table just seconds before the family's lawyer slid a thick stack of papers toward the elegant young woman. Every eye in the room locked onto her. 80-year-old Kalen Voss sat silently in his wheelchair, his weathered hands trembling as he watched his 3 adult children wait for the woman beside him to make one signature. One signature would prove they had been right about her all along. "If you really love our father," his eldest daughter Maria said with icy confidence, "then you won't mind signing away every claim to his fortune." The room fell silent. Even the lawyer looked uncomfortable. The woman glanced at the papers, then quietly smiled. "I'll sign them," she said. The siblings exchanged victorious looks. They had spent months gathering evidence, whispering behind closed doors, convincing relatives that their father had become another lonely old millionaire trapped by a beautiful younger woman. Today, they believed, the mask would finally come off. What none of them knew was that the woman had already signed another document weeks earlier. It began 12 years earlier, on the night he saved her life. On most Friday evenings, Dr. Kalen Voss was the last surgeon to leave St. Aurelius Medical Center. The hospital had become a second home to him. Nurses often joked that if they ever couldn't find him in the operating room, they would probably discover him comforting a frightened patient or sitting beside a worried family in the waiting area. At 68, his reputation extended far beyond the city. People knew him as one of the country's finest cardiothoracic surgeons. But those who worked beside him admired him for something else entirely. He never looked at a patient and saw an insurance card. He saw a life worth saving. That evening had already stretched into 14 exhausting hours. Kalen had completed 2 open-heart surgeries and was preparing to head home when his phone buzzed. Multi-vehicle collision, the emergency department informed him. "One critical cardiac trauma. We need you back downstairs." Without a second thought, he turned around. In another part of the city, 26-year-old Lysandra Vale had no idea her life was about to change forever. She had just finished tutoring 2 children whose mother insisted on paying her with homemade food because she couldn't afford cash. Lysandra accepted the casserole with genuine gratitude. She knew what it felt like to struggle, and she would never embarrass someone trying their best. Walking toward the bus stop, she smiled to herself. "It'll last me 3 days," she whispered, clutching the warm dish against her coat. The rain began without warning. Within minutes, the streets were slick with water as drivers hurried to escape the storm. Lysandra waited patiently at the crossing, watching the traffic light count down. 5, 4, 3. The signal turned green. She stepped onto the crosswalk. A deafening horn shattered the evening. A delivery truck sped through the red light, its tires skidding helplessly across the rain-soaked pavement. Someone screamed. Lysandra turned her head just in time to see the headlights rushing toward her. Everything went black. When the ambulance arrived at St. Aurelius Medical Center, chaos followed it through the emergency doors. Female, mid-20s. Severe chest trauma. Blood pressure dropping. Possible cardiac rupture. The trauma team surrounded the gurney as it raced toward the operating theater. Kalen looked down for only a second before issuing calm, rapid instructions. Prepare or 2. Notify anesthesia. Cross-match 4 units. His voice never rose. It never needed to. Everyone moved. Because they trusted him. A nurse hurried beside him. "Doctor, she has no family listed." Then tonight Kalen replied without slowing his pace. "We're her family." Those words lingered in the room long after the operating theater doors closed. The surgery lasted nearly 7 hours. Twice. Lysandra's heart stopped. Twice. The monitors erupted into frantic alarms. Twice. Members of the surgical team exchanged worried glances that silently asked the same question. Can we still save her? Each time, Kalen refused to surrender. "We're not losing her," he said firmly, simply as though failure had never been an option. Outside, dawn slowly painted the horizon with soft shades of gold. Inside, a faint heartbeat finally echoed across the monitor. It was steady, weak, but alive. The room fell silent. One nurse quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Another whispered, "She's going to make it." Only then did Kalen remove his surgical gloves. He looked through the glass window at the unconscious young woman. "Welcome back," he murmured. 3 days later, Lysandra slowly opened her eyes. Everything hurt. Her chest felt impossibly heavy. Machines hummed beside her bed. She blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling before panic settled in. A nurse noticed immediately. "Easy," she said gently. "You're safe." "What happened?" "You were in an accident." Lysandra's eyes widened. "My heart. The surgery was successful." "My heart?" "The doctor repaired the damage." She swallowed hard. I can't afford surgery." The nurse's smile faded. She had heard those words far too many times. Before she could answer, someone knocked softly on the door. "Doctor." Kalen Voss stepped inside. He looked tired. The faint shadows beneath his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much. Yet his smile carried the quiet reassurance of someone who had delivered good news thousands of times. "I see you've decided to wake up." Lysandra stared at him. "You're the surgeon?" "I was part of the team." The nurse chuckled. "He led the team." Embarrassed, Kalen gently changed the subject. "How are you feeling?" "Alive. I'll take that." For the first time since the accident, Lysandra smiled. It was small, fragile, but genuine. Later that afternoon, as Kalen reviewed her chart, he noticed something unusual. No visitors, no flowers, no phone calls. He asked one of the nurses quietly, "Has anyone come for her?" She shook her head. "No one." "Parents?" "Both deceased." "Siblings?" "None listed." "Friends?" The nurse hesitated. "We've tried every contact she gave us. No answer." Kalen nodded thoughtfully. Then he walked to the hospital cafe. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a tray with hot soup, fresh bread, and tea. "You didn't have to do that," Lysandra said softly. "I know." She looked at the tray. "I can't pay for it." Kalen smiled. "I wasn't selling it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lysandra whispered something that almost disappeared beneath the sound of the heart monitor. "Why are you being so kind to me?" It wasn't a question she had asked lightly. Life had taught her that kindness usually came with conditions. People expected something in return. Money, favors, gratitude, something. Kalen pulled up a chair. "When I was a young doctor," he began, "an elderly patient told me something I've never forgotten. She said, 'The world gives us enough reasons to stop caring. Don't become one of them.'" Lysandra lowered her eyes. "I think I've become one of those reasons." "What makes you say that?" "My fiancé left after I was diagnosed." She laughed bitterly. "My landlord says he can't wait forever. My savings are gone. My students probably think I abandoned them." She looked toward the window. "I've become everyone's problem." Kalen listened without interrupting. When she finished, he spoke only one sentence. "No." She looked back at him. "You became someone's responsibility." She frowned. "I don't understand." He smiled gently. "The night you arrived here, every doctor in that operating room accepted responsibility for bringing you back." He stood. "And now, your responsibility is simply to live." Those words stayed with Lysandra long after he left the room. She repeated them silently to herself over and over. "My responsibility is simply to live." She had no way of knowing that the man who had just spoken those words would one day become the center of the greatest misunderstanding of his life. Or that years later, the world would accuse her of loving him for everything he owned, when the truth was far more extraordinary. Recovery did not feel like healing for Lysandra Vale. It felt like time had simply stopped long enough for her body to catch up with what it had survived. Days passed inside St. Aurelius Medical Center, each one quieter than the last. The machines beside her bed slowly became less intimidating. The beeping heart monitor that once felt like a warning now sounded almost like a reminder, proof that she was still here when she should not have been. Dr. Kalen Voss did not visit often, but when he did, the entire energy of the room shifted. He never entered like a man seeking attention. He entered like someone who had already decided what needed to be done and was simply returning to ensure it remained stable. Sometimes he checked her chart. Sometimes he asked a simple question, "Pain today?" Or "Sleep better?" And sometimes he said nothing at all. But those were the moments Lysandra noticed the most. Because silence from him did not feel empty. It felt intentional. On the 5th day, Lysandra sat up for the first time without assistance. A nurse helped adjust her pillows and smiled encouragingly. You're improving faster than expected, she said. Lysandra gave a weak smile. Or I just don't have anything else to go back to. The nurse hesitated at that, unsure how to respond. But Lysandra didn't elaborate. She had grown used to speaking less about her life. Explaining it never seemed to make things better. Later that afternoon, Kalen entered the room holding a folder. He paused when he saw her sitting upright. You look less like you've been fighting for your life, he said. And more like I lost? She asked lightly. A faint smile crossed his face, like someone who's decided to stay. That word lingered between them. Stay. Lysandra looked away toward the window. I don't know where I would even go. Kalen pulled up a chair. That's not the same thing. She didn't answer. Instead, she asked the question that had been sitting inside her for days. Why did you really save me? Kalen didn't react immediately. He leaned back slightly, considering her question as if it had more weight than medical charts or surgical decisions. I told you already, he said finally. Because you needed help. That's not what I mean. Her voice was softer now. I mean, people walked past me before you did. I remember that part. I remember lying there and thinking I was invisible. She looked at him directly. But you stopped. Kalen's gaze softened, but he did not interrupt. People like me don't get that kind of attention, she continued. Not unless there's something in it for them. A pause. Was there something in it for you? The question was not angry. It was tired. Kalen looked at her for a long moment before answering. No. That single word carried no hesitation. No defense. Just certainty. Lysandra studied him as though trying to find the flaw in that answer. But there was none. That unsettled her more than anything else. 2 days later, Lysandra was discharged from intensive care. The hospital arranged temporary paperwork, a short-term medication plan, and follow-up appointments she had no idea how she would afford. When she was wheeled out of her room, she paused at the doorway. It felt strange leaving a place that had become her entire world for over a week. Kalen stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. You'll need to take it easy, he said. I don't have the luxury of taking it easy, she replied without thinking. The words came out sharper than she intended. A brief silence followed. Then Kalen nodded once. Then, take it carefully. That correction was simple. But it landed differently. No judgment. No pity. Just adjustment. As if her life was something worth adapting to, not dismissing. At the exit, the nurse handed Lysandra a small envelope. Discharge instructions, she said gently. Lysandra accepted it, but did not open it. She already knew what was inside. Bills, medications, appointments she could not afford. Outside the hospital, the world was loud again. Cars. People. Movement, life, continuing as though nothing had happened. Lysandra stood still for a moment. It felt wrong, like she had been returned to a life that had not agreed to receive her back. She turned slightly toward Kalen. Thank you, she said. He nodded. That's not necessary. It is to me. A pause. Then she added quietly, I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Kalen looked at her not as a doctor now, but as something else. Something harder to define. Then don't, he said. Lysandra frowned slightly. I don't understand. He stepped a little closer, just enough that his voice didn't get lost in the noise of the street. Most people think life is a balance sheet, he said. You save me, I save you. We become even. He shook his head slightly. But that's not how it works. Lysandra listened closely. Some things are not meant to be repaid, he continued. They are meant to continue. Continue? Yes. He glanced toward the hospital behind them. You are alive. That is the continuation. She looked confused. Kalen's voice softened. Promise me something. She hesitated. What? If life ever gives you the chance. He paused. Don't ignore someone else the way the world almost ignored you. Lysandra swallowed. That's your repayment? Kalen smiled faintly. That's all I would ever ask for. Something shifted in her expression then. Like a seed being planted in soil it would take years to grow through. I promise, she said quietly. Kalen nodded once. Good. That evening, Lysandra returned to the small rented room above the bakery. It was exactly as she had left it. But now, it felt different. She placed the hospital envelope on the table and finally opened it. The numbers inside made her stomach tighten. Even with partial assistance, even with charity reductions, the amount was impossible. She sat down slowly. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, uncertainty returned, but it was no longer mixed with hopelessness. Instead, she remembered something Kaylin had said. Your responsibility is simply to live. She repeated it quietly to herself. Live, outside. The city lights flickered through her window. And somewhere far across town, in a house she had never seen, Dr. Kaylin Voss sat alone in his study, unaware that the woman he had saved was about to step into a future that would one day collide with his own life again, in a way neither of them could ever prepare for. 12 years did not pass gently. They carved themselves into Kaylin Voss's life like time always does quietly at first. Then all at once, when you are not looking, the hospital changed names. New doctors arrived. Old colleagues retired. But Kaylin remained, not because he had to, because he did not know how to stop. At 70 years old, he was no longer the man who sprinted through operating rooms or stayed awake for entire weekends without rest. His hands were still steady, but slower now, his steps measured, his presence quieter, yet his reputation had only grown. To younger surgeons, he was a legend. To patients, he was the doctor they hoped for but rarely got. And to his own children, he was something else entirely, a man they did not fully understand anymore. His eldest daughter, Maria Voss, had become a corporate attorney. Everything about her life was precision: appointments, contracts, outcomes. She believed emotions were liabilities people used to justify poor decisions. Her younger brother, Calix, worked in finance. He measured everything in value. If something did not generate profit, it was unnecessary. That belief extended even to people. The youngest, Saren, had learned silence as strategy. She observed more than she spoke, but when she did speak, it was usually aligned with the others. Together they had grown into adults who respected their father's name, but not always his choices. Especially not the way he gave away his time. They never understood why Kaylin still spent hours with patients who could not pay. Why he approved procedures for people the hospital had already labeled non-viable financially. Why he sometimes arrived home late, exhausted, with no explanation other than "I had to stay." To them it was incomprehensible. To Kaylin it was simple. Some lives could not be measured in numbers. The first time they truly argued about it was after a board meeting. Mariah placed a folder on the table in front of him. "We need to talk about your discretion cases," she said. Kaylin looked up slowly. "My what?" "Your charity patients," Calix clarified. "The hospital is absorbing costs that should be filtered." Kaylin leaned back slightly. "You mean people who need help?" Mariah sighed. "This isn't about morality, Father, it's about sustainability." "Those are people," he said calmly. Calix shook his head. "They are liabilities if we're being honest." That word landed heavily in the room. Kaylin looked at his son for a long moment. "Do you hear yourself?" Calix didn't flinch. "I hear someone who understands how systems work." A silence followed. Then Maria added, "We're not asking you to stop caring. We're asking you to stop being Navy." That word hurt more than they realized. Knave, as if compassion was an error in judgment. Kaylin stood slowly. "I've spent 50 years saving people you would have written off before they even reached the door," he said quietly. "If that is knave, then I hope I never become wise." And with that, he left the room. That night, alone in his study, Kaylin opened an old drawer. Inside were medals he never displayed, letters from patients he rarely reread, and one faded photograph. A woman in a hospital bed. Unfamiliar face. Unforgettable moment. He had never known her name after discharge. Lysandra Vale had vanished from his life as quietly as she had entered it. But he remembered something she said once. "I thought I was going to die." And something he had replied. "Your responsibility is simply to live." He closed the drawer. He had assumed she had done exactly that. He had no reason to believe otherwise. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Lysandra Vale no longer existed as the woman she once was. She had rebuilt herself slowly, painfully, deliberately. The medical debt had forced her into survival mode first. Then opportunity arrived in ways she never expected. A former patient she had once tutored recommended her for administrative work at a non-profit health foundation. From there, she learned systems. Funding, grants policy, she studied at night, worked during the day. And when exhaustion came, she remembered a man in a hospital hallway saying, "Don't ignore someone else the way the world almost ignored you." It became her anchor. Years later, that same nonprofit expanded into a national healthcare initiative, focused on emergency access for underprivileged patients. And Lysandra Vale, once a woman on a rain-soaked sidewalk, became one of its quiet architects. She never chased attention, never sought recognition, but her name appeared in reports, then conferences, then board discussions, and eventually, in conversations she was not even present for. To most people, she was simply Miss Vale from the foundation. But to those who worked closely with her, she was someone who understood suffering not as theory, but as memory. One winter evening, a new proposal crossed her desk. A major hospital network wanted partnership funding approval. The name on the document caught her attention. St. Aurelius Medical Center. She paused. Something unexplainable tightened in her chest. She read the proposal carefully. Expansion, funding, emergency cardiac programs. Her fingers slowed when she reached the medical advisory list. There it was, a name she had not seen in 12 years. Dr. Kaylin Voss. For a moment, the room around her felt distant, not unreal, just suspended. She leaned back in her chair. The man who had saved her life, the man she had never thanked properly, the man she had promised, quietly in a small rented room above a bakery, to one day repay by saving someone else. She exhaled slowly. "I didn't forget," she whispered, and for the first time in a very long time, her past and present began moving toward each other. Unaware that across the city, Kaylin Voss was about to face a storm he never saw, coming not from medicine, but from his own children's judgment of a woman he once saved. The decision to confront her did not happen all at once. It grew the way suspicion often does in families like the Voss household: quiet conversations, selective interpretations, and conclusions repeated so often they began to feel like truth. It started with Maria. She had been reviewing the partnership proposal for the St. Aurelius expansion when she noticed the advisory board list. Her eyes stopped on one name. Lysandra Vale, Executive Advisor, National Health Initiative. She frowned. "Who is she?" she asked during dinner that evening. Kaylin looked up from his plate. "Lysandra Vale," he repeated slowly, as if retrieving the memory from a place he rarely visited. "She works in healthcare policy now, I believe." Maria exchanged a glance with Calix. "That's the woman attached to the funding proposal you support?" "Yes." Calix leaned forward. "How do you know her?" A pause. Kaylin set down his utensils. "I saved her life." That sentence should have ended the conversation. But it didn't. Instead, it created something else. Curiosity, mixed with doubt. Maria tilted her head slightly. "Saved her life, how exactly?" "A cardiac trauma," Kaylin replied calmly. "She was brought in after a severe accident. We operated for hours." Calix narrowed his eyes. "And now she's in a position to approve millions in funding for your hospital?" Kaylin frowned, slightly. "That's not why I told you this." But they were no longer listening to intention. They were listening to pattern. And the pattern they saw was not kindness. It was dependency. Over the next week, the conversation changed shape. At first it was subtle. "She seems closely tied to you professionally," Saren mentioned. Then sharper. "It's unusual for someone with her background to rise that quickly," Calix added. Finally, it became what it had been building toward all along. "She's leveraging your history," Maria said plainly. Kaylin looked at her. "Leveraging? She's not just a board member," Calix continued. "She's influencing decisions tied directly to your hospital." "That is her job," Kaylin replied. But his voice was quieter now, not because he agreed, because he was beginning to see something else. Not truth, but their certainty. And certainty, once formed in people who believed they were rational, was difficult to break. The intervention happened on a Thursday. Lysandra was invited under the pretense of a formal partnership review at the Voss family estate. She almost declined. Large private meetings always made her uncomfortable. But something about the proposal's urgency and the hospital's future made her agree. When she arrived, the atmosphere felt wrong immediately. She was escorted into a large study where Kaylin sat at the far end of a long table. His expression was unreadable. Mireia stood near the fireplace. Calix leaned against a chair. Saren observed from a distance. Lysandra stopped. I wasn't expecting a private meeting, she said carefully. Mireia smiled politely. We prefer direct conversations. Lysandra nodded slowly and took a seat. I reviewed the proposal, she began. The emergency cardiac funding initiative is strong. We didn't invite you here for funding discussion, Mireia interrupted. Silence followed. Lysandra looked between them. I'm sorry? Calix straightened. We invited you here to clarify your intentions. That word. Intentions, it shifted the air instantly. Lysandra's posture changed slightly. My intentions? Mireia placed a folder on the table. We've done some research. Kaelin's expression tightened. Enough, he said firmly. But Mireia continued. You met our father 12 years ago under tragic circumstances. Lysandra didn't speak. We find it interesting, Calix added, that you re-enter his life now, just as you gain influence in healthcare funding. A pause. Lysandra's gaze slowly shifted toward Kaelin. Not accusing, just searching. He didn't look away. But he didn't speak either. Mireia slid the folder across the table. Inside were printed documents, financial reports, board influence charts, connections mapped in lines that looked far more intentional on paper than they ever were in real life. We believe, Mireia said carefully, that your relationship with our father is not purely professional. Lysandra blinked once. Then again. Not in shock, but in comprehension. I see, she said quietly. Calix leaned forward. If you're benefiting from this relationship, we need transparency. Lysandra exhaled slowly, and for the first time since entering the room, she smiled. Not warmly, not defensively, but with something far more controlled. You think I'm here for his money, she said. No one answered immediately. Because they did not need to. The assumption had already been made. Lysandra looked at each of them slowly. Then, at Kaelin. And, finally, back at the documents. I understand, she repeated softly. Then, she leaned back. And the silence that followed felt heavier than accusation. Because she was no longer confused. She was waiting for them to realize what they had stepped into. And none of them knew that the real truth they were trying to expose had already been written long before any of them spoke a word. The room stayed silent long after Lysandra Vale spoke. Not because she had raised her voice. Not because she had argued. But because she hadn't. That was what unsettled Mireia most. People who were guilty usually defended themselves quickly. Emotionally, loudly, Lysandra had done none of that. Instead, she simply looked at the folder on the table as if it no longer belonged to her story. Then, she looked at Kaelin Voss. And waited. Kaelin felt it immediately, that subtle shift in the air that comes when a conversation stops being about accusation and starts becoming about truth. Mireia, he said firmly, this ends now. But Lysandra lifted a hand gently. No, she said. The single word wasn't sharp. It was calm and final. Everyone turned toward her. Mireia frowned. If you're about to deny, I'm not denying anything. Lysandra interrupted. That stopped her completely. Lysandra leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the table. You wanted clarity, she said. So I'll give you clarity. A pause, but not the kind you're expecting. Calix narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? Lysandra turned the folder toward herself and opened it slowly. Her eyes scanned the pages not with shock but recognition, as if she had already seen versions of these assumptions many times before in her life. I was 26 when I met your father, she began quietly. I had no influence, no power, no money, no connections. She looked up. I had a heart condition that should have killed me on a sidewalk. Mireia's expression flickered for the first time. Lysandra continued. I was unconscious when I arrived at St. Aurelius. I had no family there, no advocate, no guarantee I would even survive surgery. Her voice remained steady. But your father didn't ask what I could offer him. He asked if I was still alive. The room shifted. Even Calix stopped moving. Lysandra closed the folder gently. And after the surgery, when I couldn't afford treatment, he didn't send me a bill. She exhaled slowly. He sent me a reminder. Mireia frowned. A reminder? Lysandra nodded. He said, Don't ignore someone else the way the world almost ignored you. Silence deepened. Kaelin's expression tightened not in anger but in memory. Lysandra turned slightly toward him. You don't remember saying it, she said softly. Kaelin didn't answer. Because he did. Now it returned to him not as a line in conversation, but as something heavier. Something he had spoken without expecting it to live this long. Lysandra looked back at the children. I didn't come back into your father's life, she said. I built a life because of what he said to me. And I made a promise. Saren tilted her head slightly. A promise? Lysandra nodded once. That if I ever had the power to save lives the way mine was saved, I would. She looked down at her hands. I didn't think I would ever see him again. Her voice softened slightly. But I never forgot him. The silence in the room now was different. It wasn't suspicion. It was recalculation. Calix glanced at the documents again, but they suddenly looked meaningless in comparison to what he was hearing. Mireille's confidence wavered. But, the funding influence, Lysandra looked at her gently. You think I need your father's approval to exist in my position? I don't. Then she leaned back. And I certainly didn't need it to become who I am. Kaelin finally spoke. Lysandra. But she shook her head lightly, still calm. I came here today to review a partnership, she said. Then she looked at each of them one by one. Not to be judged for surviving the man who saved my life. That sentence landed differently. Heavier, clearer and final. Mariah looked down first. Calix shifted uncomfortably. Saren said nothing, but her silence had changed shape. Because something had broken inside the narrative they had built. Not violently, but completely. Later that evening, after Lysandra had left the estate, Kaelin stood alone by the window. Mireille entered quietly behind him. We were wrong, she said. Kaelin didn't turn. I know. A long pause followed. Then, Mireille spoke again, softer this time. She wasn't what we thought. Kaelin's eyes remained on the darkening sky. No, he said quietly. She never was. Another silence. Then he added something lower. She was the consequence of a moment I forgot I ever mattered in someone else's life. Mireille frowned slightly. What does that mean? Kaelin finally turned, and for the first time in a long time, his voice carried something fragile. Sometimes, he said, we don't realize what we save, until it comes back to save the world we built without it. And across the city, Lysandra Vale sat in her office alone, the city lights reflected off her desk. She placed a small folder inside a drawer. At the very top was a handwritten note she had never shown anyone, a promise she made 12 years ago. If I survive this, I will make sure no one is ever ignored the way I was. She closed the drawer slowly, and whispered to herself, I kept my promise. But neither she, nor Kaelin, nor the children who once called her a gold digger, knew that the story was not finished. Because the most painful truths in life are not the ones that destroy lies. They are the ones that reveal how little we understood love in the first place. If this story touched your heart, remember that people are often carrying battles we know nothing about. Never judge someone before knowing their journey. If you believe kindness, loyalty, and compassion still matter, share this story with someone who needs this reminder. And don't forget to follow Moments and Meanings for more emotional stories and life lessons that stay with you long after the story ends.